this wonderful opportunity to participate in such a positive and worthwhile project. It's great to see the inventiveness and care with which organisations like Westminster Briefing are adapting to times of major disruption like these. I'm going to share some thoughts today that they might be shocking for some and may raise more questions than they answer, but I'm at peace with that. My perspective comes from my experience as Director of Global Inclusion and Diversity for KPMG, looking after around 200,000 people in 154 countries on all aspects of inclusion and diversity. It all comes also from my experience in founding, and in some cases leading, several of KPMG's global diversity networks, notably Global Pride at KPMG, our global LGBT network, the Global Women's Network, and the Global Disability Network. Externally, I've got experience and insights from membership of a number of globally focused inclusion initiatives, such as the Disability Business Forum's Global Task Force, Open for Business, which exists as putting the economic case for LGBT+ inclusion around the world, and the all-party parliamentary group on global LGBT rights in the UK, to which I was recently appointed as a member of the advisory network. I've also got client-facing experience around inclusion and diversity from advising a range of organisations on the challenges of inclusion and diversity in many sectors, from public housing, things like manufacturing, travel, and from my membership of a number of global diversity advisory boards, including those of, for example, an international hotel chain and a pharmaceutical giant. So you can see my experience spans private, public, and third sectors, and includes an understanding of my own organisation's experiences, as well as those of other organisations and other sectors from every region of the world, and pretty much every country. So from this perspective, there are lots of themes that emerge, but I've chosen three that I think create powerful opportunities for all of us, not just now, but for the long term. And they also raise profound and sometimes uncomfortable questions as we ponder what life might be like when and if it returns to normal, whatever that means. And that's assuming we even want to return to normal. So the three propositions I'll speak to briefly are as follows. The first one is that cultural intelligence is key. Times of above average disruption call for enhanced leadership and management skills around cultural intelligence and colleague welfare. So I'll speak to that. So that's the first one, cultural intelligence. The second one is we have a base to build from already. In the global context, we're already familiar to a greater or lesser degree with things like remote working, virtual meetings, and managing across differences in time and space. And we can harness this experience to adapt better to current and future conditions. So that's the third thing I'll talk to. Second thing, sorry. And then the third thing is love is the answer. Now, the word love is all but taboo in the workplace, yet it's one of the most powerful expressions of what it means to feel included. So we have a unique opportunity to reframe what global working means using the power of love. So let's take these in turn. Firstly, cultural intelligence. What is it, and why would I say this is key? Well, the kind of culture we're talking about here is not the superficial national culture we sometimes think of when we talk about, the global context, such as clothing people wear, the food they typically eat, that kind of thing. Nor is it the supposed national differences in culture around things like attitudes to time, power relationships, respect for hierarchy, attention to detail, and so on. Instead, I'm talking about the day-to-day culture as shown by the way we all behave in the workplace, and the profound understanding that good leaders and managers have for supporting the welfare and sense of security of employees. Now, let's be honest, most workplaces, particularly larger ones, are basically a form of modified factory. Now, we could argue whether that statement is verifiable, and we'll have to leave that discussion for another time. But it's relevant as a kind of working assumption here, because under normal circumstances, what I mean by workplaces being a kind of factory is that there are typically structures and processes in place in most organizations that enable them to operate in spite of, rather than because of, the level of competence of most leaders and managers. In other words, you can actually get away with being a pretty poor leader in an organization when things are operating normally. Because if you fall down as a leader, there's usually a compensatory mechanism in place to cope with that, or at least to some degree. But when there are above average levels of disruption, such as arguably we're living through now, then those mechanisms may be compromised. And in my experience, at least, these mechanisms are more fragile in the context of global interactions. Now, the reasons why this might be the case are complex. We don't have time to go into them now. It's worth noting that the issue might be partly to do with the tightening of focus that many organizations and people react with during times of challenge. It's easy to be open-minded, open to others, supportive of others, and situationally aware when everything's going well. But when we or our organizations are under stress, there can be a temptation to focus inwards and close off our field of vision so that we can kind of cope better. Now, that might all be related to things like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm sure you're well aware of that hierarchy or that circle. And maybe we're back down now at the moment at the lower level, the base level, worrying about things like food, shelter, health, livelihoods, employment, rather than self-actualization or contribution. Anyway, whatever the case, now more than ever, I believe that leaders and managers are called to draw deeply on their skills to understand cultural difference so they can act to support colleagues who may be at different places in that hierarchy or that circle of needs. And I say this is key because it has a direct impact on how effective leaders and managers are when working in a global context at a time like this. So that's all great in terms of theory and it's all very high level. What are the practical steps that organizations, leaders and managers can take? Well, I think they include three things. One is upskilling, one is practice, and the other is clarification. On upskilling, I think we need to upskill on cultural intelligence in a global context. Now, this could include things like learning how to interact and read the needs and emotions of colleagues through virtual communications like phone, video conferencing, and even email. Not many of us have learned the really advanced version of this. We can kind of read someone's body language when we're face to face, but how many of us are skilled at doing that via video conference or from an email? Organizations can provide leaders and managers with online training and safe spaces where they can practice these skills in a learning environment. Second thing I mentioned was practicing. I think we need to practice these cultural intelligence skills in real life situations. Many of you would know that we too often send our leaders to classrooms, whether they're virtual classrooms or physical ones, and then they come back to the workplace environment and they never actually practice the skills they learned in theory in the classroom. It's kind of like learning tennis. You can't do it from a book or in a classroom. You need to get out and practice for real. And then the third thing I think is we need to clarify what's expected of our leaders. Organizations are faced with a new challenge now: how to incentivize, reward, and develop leaders and managers under these unusual conditions, where some of the usual feedback and observation mechanisms are either unavailable or significantly altered. I think it would be really unfair for organizations to just expect leaders to adapt overnight to these new conditions in a global context and judge their performance based on a completely different paradigm. And for me, there are a couple of key questions that emerge from this proposition around the importance of cultural intelligence. The first question is, do we as leaders and managers understand what cultural intelligence and inclusion actually are? And do we understand our own skill levels around them? Second question, are we prepared as organizations to invest in the skills required to ensure we can operate globally under the current disruption and the future new paradigm? And thirdly, do we have the organizational maturity to recognize that we are at a crucial inflection point in how we recognize, reward, and develop our leaders and managers in this global context? Or are we just going to pretend that the old paradigm still fits? So that's the first area to discuss around kind of cultural intelligence and inclusion. My second proposition, though, is that there is good news because we already have a base to build from. Most organisations that operate globally are used to some of the tools and skills that pretty much everyone is being called on to use a lot more at the moment, like video conferencing, remote working, the multiple handoff of tasks from one side of the world to the other. Now, of course, not all global teams are geographically dispersed. I look at the organisations I've worked in or that I have knowledge of, and many of them have clusters of teams in the same geographic location where face-to-face interaction does normally happen daily. But there's almost always some degree of remote working or virtual interaction, and building on this is something we can harness to ensure we continue to foster a culture of inclusion for our colleagues. Nevertheless, I do know that the lived experience of our colleagues must be a major consideration for leaders and managers. And when I talk about lived experience, it won't do to assume that the whole world experiences things the way they are in head office or as they are written down in policies and procedures. So what are the practical steps we can take to harness what we're already doing well and build on that? Well, I think there are three things. One of them is being intentional about building bridges from what we do now to what we're going to do next. The other is consider creating team charters. And the third is to build up resilience and encourage momentum. So if we think about being intentional about building bridges from what we are already used to doing to the new ways of working, what I mean by this is we could point out to colleagues really clearly that in some ways we're just doing an enhanced version of what we've been doing already. The world, I know, it feels very uncertain and unstable to a lot of our colleagues, but actually we all jointly have the skills and experience of managing and building team cultures from the far corners of the world. We're already doing that really well in a lot of cases. So let's recognize this and build on it. Boost the confidence of your colleagues by reminding them that they can do this. And we know they can do it because they've already been doing it. And the second thing is consider creating team charters that set out new ways of working so that we can maintain and build on our culture and ensure inclusion remains part of how we do things. I did this myself, for example, with our LGBT plus network in the UK, drafting a discussion paper for us to consider what changes we'd need to make to the way we operated as a diversity network under this new paradigm. I would make sure that you invite everyone in the team to contribute and use lots of different ways of getting input. So not just group discussion on Zoom, but also use email, use voting buttons, use collaborative virtual workspaces, use invitations to specific individuals to get their feedback and so forth. Make sure the process is fully inclusive and go out of your way as a leader to seek out input from those who are often left out of the discussion. I would make the charter as concrete as possible. So, for example, rather than saying things like, oh, we will act inclusively as a team, we will treat each other with respect, I would make it really concrete. Say something like, we will start each meeting by asking everyone to share how they are feeling, and end every meeting by asking everyone to share, I don't know, their main insight from the meeting and any questions or concerns they have. The third thing is building up resilience and encouraging momentum by creating, I don't know, some kind of progress review as part of this new normal. I would keep this as simple as possible to avoid creating an admin burden. So it might simply be, I don't know, a 3-question survey each week that team members from around the world provide feedback on a scale of 1 to 5 or whatever you want to use on things like, I don't know, how included they feel, how positive the culture of the team is, how supported they feel in working remotely, and whether they have the physical resources and other things they need to work effectively. There's a couple of questions that come to me from this proposal around the importance of building on what we have. The first is, have we actually carried out an honest appraisal of our existing capabilities around supporting a positive culture and inclusion under remote working conditions? Second question I'd ask myself is, have we interrogated our environments globally to understand the different conditions and experiences of our colleagues? Or do we just assume that what we experience in our location is what everyone else experiences too? And thirdly, are we prepared to adapt the organisation itself, which is quite challenging and can be daunting. It could be even dangerous to push for this. Or do we, say we support inclusion, but actually expect our colleagues to be the ones who adapt while the organisation remains unchanged? And I can think of an example where a major tech firm, global tech firm, confronted this dilemma when it set out to increase neurodiversity in its teams. And it realized early on that for this to be a success, the organization itself would actually need to change. It wouldn't work to leave the organization the way it was. And then my last proposition, and this is the one that might shock and surprise some people, I say that love is the answer. Now, this seems a really odd thing to say about workplaces in a global context. But about last August, I started asking myself the question, why is love never talked about in the workplace? Why is the word taboo? I thought about what inclusion means, and I thought of the strong sense of belonging and safety we experience when we're held in our mother's arms as babies. And this led me to think about inclusion as being a sense of belonging and how we could foster that in the workplace. Because of this, I've since refined my question about inclusion from what does belonging mean in the workplace to what does belonging feel like in the workplace, which leads me to say the answer is love. Now, how can we operationalize love in the workplace, and why would we want to? Well, for me, in the current context of massive disruption to the physical workplace and the sense of fragility many of our colleagues around the world are experiencing, we need something really powerful to glue us back together. This also applies for all our colleagues who are used to working remotely and interacting virtually. I personally don't think that the old approaches will be strong enough. Checking in with each other, starting each email with, I hope you're well and safe in these unusual times, increasing our investment in welfare initiatives. Look, these are all good things, but they're fairly ordinary things, and they're just incremental. If we want step change, if we yearn for a new positive paradigm to outweigh the current negative and disruptive paradigm, I think we need to go to the extraordinary. And for me, that powerful, extraordinary thing that is missing from the workplace is love. So, practical steps we can take to push our workplaces closer to this new paradigm where love is the driver for a powerful sense of inclusion and belonging include three things: stripping our leaders back to the fundamentals, using clever tools, and conducting our first ever love audit. What I mean by stripping our leaders back, I think we need to get them back to the fundamentals and get them to experience love for themselves in the context of leadership in global organizations. Use skilled coaches from unusual, unorthodox backgrounds to awaken in our leaders and managers a profound experience of exclusion and inclusion to demonstrate the power of love. Now, this is quite challenging to do virtually, but it can be done. So, for example, some coaches use things like voice, body movement, laughter, meditation, music, or sexuality to awaken the deepest of our emotions and energies. These alternative approaches are barely tapped in the corporate world, but we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to use them. We're living through a live social and economic experiment on a global scale, after all. So let's be bold and run some experiments of our own, giving ourselves permission to do outrageous things that we'd never normally do. Second thing is to use clever tools to build empathy and love into our processes and decision making. For example, some of you may have heard of design thinking. This is an approach that uses empathy conversations as the starting point for building practical commercial solutions. We can now use tools like this globally to harness the power of empathy to build more robust solutions while making love and empathy a natural part of who we are and what we do and how we do things in the workplace. And then lastly, conduct our first ever love audit. Celebrate the power of love by revisiting everything we do through the lens of belonging. Use some kind of, maturity model, a survey, a series of discussions, or a combination of different approaches to understand whether everything we do, everything we subject our people and our stakeholders to is driven by love. Does everyone feel free to talk about love in the workplace? Does everyone experience it? Would all our colleagues recommend us as a place to work because of the extraordinary sense of love and belonging they experience? Would our clients do the same? And then my key challenging questions from this proposition. Firstly, do we have the courage to embrace love is the answer in the workplace? Secondly, are we prepared to change in response to the potential cognitive dissonance that a focus on love in the workplace might create for us as an organisation and for our people? Will we seek to minimise and manage that dissonance away, or will we embrace it and grow as a result? And lastly, how concerned are we that colleagues in different parts of the world may respond negatively to such a bold initiative as this? Are we prepared to be patient and to hear the concerns of those who disagree with the initiative or are nervous about it? Do we have the humility to take this bold step into the unknown without turning it into a corporate project and killing it off? So I've shared with you a few of my thoughts in this interesting, unusual, exciting and challenging time. I'm really excited that this initiative is underway. This project is fantastic. And I hope that by thinking about these three potential areas that we could look at for what our colleagues experience globally when it comes to remote working and managing through this time, has been about the importance of cultural intelligence, the fact that we have good news because we have a base to build from already, and then the opportunity to take this extraordinary step and be bold to embrace love as the answer.